problem with the internet connection, so my apologies again for everybody. We'll be starting now. So my apologies. I get cut off from the system for some reason. So anyway, coming back to the issue, I was talking about late Shireen Abu Akleh, the journalist that was killed by the Israelis. And coincidentally, this morning, another journalist was shot dead by Israeli army in Hebron refugee camp. This looks like an ongoing issue, the Israeli shooting Palestinian civilians. I think since Shireen Abu Akleh was killed on the 11th of last month, I think about a dozen Palestinians were killed, including 2 or 3 children. Anyway, to talk about these issues, if the Abraham Accord helped the situation in the West Bank and Gaza, or helped the situation between the Palestinians and the Israelis, or got worse, we have 3 speakers. Actually, Diane Buttu could not join us. She had an emergency just 30 minutes ago, and she's not going to join us, but we have 2 distinguished speakers. Dr. Mustafa Barghouti, I think many of you know Mustafa Barghouti. He's a well-known Palestinian activist and leader. He's Secretary General and co-founder of the Palestinian National Initiative, PNI, also known as Mubadara. PNI seeks to develop mass nonviolence and international solidarity as the preferred means of resisting Israeli occupation. We also have, he resides in Ramallah, West Bank, and we have also a journalist, Maha Hussaini, is the Secretary Director of Euromed Human Rights Monitor and an award-winning journalist based in Gaza. She's also an activist and a human rights activist also. We'll start with Dr. Barghouti. Okay, Dr. Barghouti, I learned he was running late. He's stuck in a traffic, I think, to Ramallah or to his office. We'll start with Maha Hussaini.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having this meeting. Can you hear me very well?
Yes, we hear you fine. Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for organizing this webinar addressing this very important and timely subject now. As we've been documenting, as you said a few hours ago, the demolishing also of a Palestinian home in the Al Isawiya neighborhood in Jerusalem, and the killing of a 31-year-old lady also this morning. Around 10 days ago, I guess, we have commemorated the first anniversary of Israel's military attack on the Gaza Strip last May, an attack that was launched only 9 months after the Abraham Accords were announced. These days, we have been commemorating the killing of 256 Palestinians, most of whom civilians, including 67 children and 40 women who were targeted, most of whom were targeted inside their homes in the densely populated Gaza Strip. And the Abraham Accords we're talking about today, actually the declaration of these accords starts, and I'm quoting the very first sentence of the accords, which reads, we, the undersigned, recognize the importance of maintaining and strengthening peace in the Middle East and around the world based on mutual understanding and coexistence, as well as respect for human dignity and freedom, including religious freedom. Actually, the fact that a devastating, deadly military attack was launched a few months after the Accords, and all these daily abuses and violations of the right to life, to dignity, to religious freedom are occurring every hour, not just every day, in the Palestinian territories in general and in the Gaza Strip in particular. All of this indicate the extent to which the Abraham Accords actually maintained and strengthened peace in the Palestinian, or improved the life of Palestinians, as they claim, actually. Since the accords were signed, we can confidently say that data and facts on the ground indicate that the situation in the Palestinian territories and in the Gaza Strip in particular has dramatically deteriorated on all levels, whether on the level of human rights, economic situation, the daily life of Palestinians, whether we're talking about health, freedom of movement, safety, etc. Only a few days ago, Israeli forces, as you said, killed Palestinian journalist Shireen Abu Akleh while she was covering the news. And the fact that a well-known journalist has been killed is not just a matter of being a flagrant violation, for example, of international law or international humanitarian law, but also the fact that Israel has been committing such abuses at a time when Arab countries are normalizing relations, let's say, and signing agreements with it, indicates the serious consequences of supporting and encouraging a government that is accused by the international community of committing war crimes and crimes against humanity. This is simply actually a green light given to the perpetrators to continue what they have been doing for decades and what they are willing to do for the next years. In the Gaza Strip in particular, where I live, Euromed Human Rights Monitor has documented shocking facts on the ground. For example, which we have worked on, the annual report, I mean. This report includes facts about the blockade of the Gaza Strip. For example, by the beginning of this year, 2022, about 1.5 million Palestinians of the residents of the total population of 2.3 million have become impoverished due to the Israeli blockade and the restrictions imposed on the Strip since 2006. And despite the deterioration of the humanitarian situation of the Gaza Strip and the succession of around 7 Israeli governments since the beginning of the blockade, the Israeli collective punishment policy against the population of Gaza remains in place. Even maybe after the Abraham Accords, it has deteriorated dramatically. And the fact that this is still happening in a way that clearly exposes Israel's intention to inflict great damage and moral damage on the residents of the Gaza Strip indicates the extent actually to which these accords have encouraged Israel to do what they have been doing for decades. For instance, the unemployment rate we're talking about has risen from 23.6% before the imposition of the blockade. Today, we are talking about a percentage that has rising up to 50.2% by the end of 2021. So it remains one of the highest in the world. Also, poverty, for example, has risen sharply due to the Israeli closures and bans from 40% in 2005 to 69 today, 69% in 2021. So the last military attack I was talking about in May 2021 alone resulted in the destruction of hundreds of economic facilities with a total loss of about $400 million. And I'm talking about figures and numbers based on international reports, including UN reports, etc. The health sector is also one of the most affected by the blockade since Israel prevents or limits the entry of medicines and medical supplies into Gaza, causing health care services to decline by 66% also. And the fact that the blockade has been imposed for more than 16 years now means that there is a whole generation in the Gaza Strip whose the majority has never seen the area beyond the Gaza border fence. The vast majority of the Strip's residents today remain deprived of their basic right to movement and travel through the areas crossing. According to Gisha, for example, which is an Israeli human rights organization, the monthly average of cases Israel allowed to exit through areas before the blockade was 30,000 cases before. And the average fell by 70% today since then. to reach 8,000 only, 8,000.9 cases a month. And although Israel has recently allowed, maybe you have heard that the Israeli government has allowed about 20 to 30,000 Palestinians from the Gaza Strip recently, basically following the Israeli attack in May. They have allowed this number to work in Israel, Palestinians from Gaza to work in Israel. Although this move maybe has been seen by many as an attempt to strengthen the fragile calm between Israel and the armed factions in the Gaza Strip, or to enhance the humanitarian situation as Israel actually promotes, the fact actually is that this is far from true. For years, Israel has been using its control over the borders to coerce Palestinians into sharing sensitive information or collaborating with Israel and sharing information about Palestinian armed groups in exchange for their right to travel or to work in Israel. And there are documented cases in which Israel extorted Palestinian workers from Gaza before and after its recent announcement. Like, I have personally interviewed people from the Interior Ministry of Gaza and from the Gisha organization, the Israeli organization, who have reported there are cases where Israeli officers at the Ares border, which Israel controls in the northern Gaza Strip, when they have interviewed people who are wishing to work in Israel, they have offered them to collaborate with Israel. Many of them, or the majority of them, have refused to submit or share sensitive information, and they have been denied permits or the right to movement or the right to travel. And there are actually cases of sick or patient people. Most of them are cancer patients who are also coerced into submitting and sharing sensitive information in exchange for their right to medical treatment and travel. This is just a glimpse of the situation that has been exacerbating since the accords have been signed with the government of Israel, and a government actually that turns a blind eye to international law and international condemnations for the past decades. Israel has been actually rewarded for showing complete disregard and disrespect for international human rights and all the calls by the international community, including the United Nations and its inquiry committees established to investigate its war crimes in the occupied Palestinian territories and in the Gaza Strip in particular. For instance, I remember that during Israel's 2014 attack on the Gaza Strip, we have been working closely with international groups and also the UN investigated or inquiry committee, let's say. During this attack named Operation Protective Edge, physicians on the ground and human rights groups reported that Israeli forces used unconventional weapons, including nail bombs and dime munition, and to investigate possible war crimes and other human rights violations committed during the attack by both Israel and the Palestinian armed groups. The UN appointed an independent commission of inquiry, but as usual, actually, the Israeli government refused to cooperate with the UN team, including Mikarim Wibisono, the late UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Palestinian territories. Israel refused to grant him access to the Palestinian territories, causing him to resign in 2016. The Israeli government also refused to cooperate with the next special rapporteur that was appointed after Mikarim Wibisono, which was Michael Link, who was appointed in 2016, and denied him also access to the occupied Palestinian territories in 2019. And while Israel prevents international experts from observing and documenting human rights violations on the ground by both Israel also and the Palestinian groups, they continue to ethnically cleanse thousands or dozens of thousands of Palestinians from their towns and villages, including by demolishing their homes on a daily basis and forcing them to leave. And in several respects, actually, the basis for the call to action against, for example, a similar case to what Israel has been doing in the Palestinian territory, which is apartheid and occupation, and also the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. A similar case was South Africa, which witnessed a similar call to action that has been made against the government of the South Africa, and now there is a similar call made against the government of Israel. And if anything, actually, the facts on the ground, the violations I've been talking about for the past few minutes, and the daily violations of human rights and war crimes committed by Israel, we can say that although this is very similar to what happened to South Africa, which has faced sanctions and boycott by the countries, Israel continues to be rewarded by not only Arab countries, but also the international community, which is encouraging it to continue what it has been doing. So in short, what we've been talking about is a serious, actually, deterioration of human rights and violations, and a serious deterioration of the situation of the humanitarian daily life of Palestinians in the Palestinian territories in general, and the Gaza Strip in particular. And what is actually needed today, more than ever, is to put such violations to an end, by imposing sanctions on Israel rather than normalization and signing accords with a government that has been recognized as committing war crimes against humanity and crimes against humanity. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Now I'll ask Dr. Mustafa Barghouti, who joined us 10 minutes ago, to say a few words.
Thank you so much, and it's good to be with you. I'm pleased to be with you today. I will be saying a few remarks about the topic from the perspective of whether these accords, Abraham Accords, have really made us closer to peace or actually distanced us from peace.
Dr. Mustafa,
I think the main argument that is used.
Can you turn your camera on, please?
I'm trying, but it seems that I have a problem with that. I can't put the camera on. Something is wrong with the computer. Okay. Let me see. It's difficult. So let me continue without the video, if that's okay. And the net is not very good, actually. So let's see. Can you see me now? No?
No. Go ahead. It's no big deal.
Hello?
We can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay, let me talk. So it was supposed that these accords were supposed or were presented as a way of getting us closer to peace. In my opinion, they distanced us from peace. Why? First of all, we all know that all these countries that decided to start normalization with Israel were part of the so-called Arab Initiative. And the Arab Initiative provided a strong incentive to Israel that if they resolve their issue with the Palestinians and allow the Palestinians to have a state of their own, and if Israel ends the occupation of Palestinian territories, then all these countries will create normal agreements with Israel. That is a very strong motivation. This is gone, and by these normalization acts, and in my opinion, it has actually made Israel more extreme and more adamant against the possibility of concluding peace with Palestinians. The second issue is that this normalization was used especially by the so-called deal of the century, which was presented by Mr. Trump, but we all know that it was really formed and created by Netanyahu and his crowd and put in an American envelope. The deal of the century of which normalization or Abraham Accords were major part, aimed practically not at a solution, but at liquidating the Palestinian issue, transforming the idea of Palestinian independent statehood into clusters of Bantustans, eliminating completely the rights of the Palestinian refugees to return home, and eliminating and allowing Israel practically to continue settlement activities. So these accords were used within the ranks of the deal of the century, not to provide a solution, but to prevent practically a solution. Unfortunately, the new American administration, Mr. Biden's administration, criticized Mr. Trump on every issue, except one, which is the normalization between Israel and the Arab countries. That is the only thing they praised and supported. And all their other promises to Palestinians, like opening the American consulate in Jerusalem, allowing the Palestinian PLO office to reopen, and the promises that the United States administration will exercise pressure to stop settlement activities, all these promises were in vain, and I do not see any sign that they will be implemented. The fourth point is that the assumption that the Abraham Accords and these countries who participated in normalization will play a role in the Palestinian issue was practically exaggerated, because these countries really, like Bahrain and Emirates and Morocco and Sudan, are marginal when it comes to the Palestinian issue, really. And in terms of, and some of them have really cut relations with Palestinians since long time. So their ability to influence the Palestinian situation is absolutely limited, as we have seen. The fifth point is that these accords and these normalization acts are in direct contradiction with feelings of the Arab people and the peoples of these countries that normalized with Israel, because the people of these states and these countries see on daily basis what's happening to Palestinians. And they're, of course, enthusiastic to the right of the Palestinian people to be free. And that's why I do not think they are supporting these deals. They are unable to express their views because of the nature of the oppressive regime in some places that they live in. But they will not really be truly participating in normalization acts. In other words, these are accords between governments that do not penetrate to become, to affect the behavior of the peoples of these countries, as long as the Palestinian is not resolved. And we have here two very strong examples. One is the example of Egypt, which had peace accords with Israel for 44 years, and Jordan, which have peace accords with Israel for more than 25 years. But the peoples of these countries do not normalize, and they continue to abstain from normalizing with Israelis, whether you talk about social contacts, whether you talk about economic cooperation, whether you talk about art or sport or anything else. In reality, these accords have eliminated a very important motivation that could have led to resolving the Palestinian issue and ending occupation. And when you dig deep, one would discover that probably the motivation of these Arab countries that made these accords with Israel are not really relevant to the Palestinian issue. In the case of the Gulf, it's mainly about relationship with Iran and their needs of certain maybe intelligence and military cooperation with Israel in what they see as their main contradiction with Iran. In the case of Sudan, it is clear that these accords are used to justify and get support for a terribly authoritarian army system that is suppressing democracy in Sudan. and to gain some American economic support to this regime. In the case of Morocco, it is definitely about the relationship with Algeria and the issue of the Sahara and Polisario. So practically, these are not issues related directly to the Palestinian issue. Unfortunately, the Israeli behavior after these accords were concluded has become much worse than before. It has the Israeli army, the Israeli governments are exercising terrible oppressive policies against Palestinians. I think all of you have seen recently what they've done to Shireen Abu Akleh, the very well-known journalist who was assassinated with a sniper fire from an Israeli army officer, probably. And Israel declares that it will not even have an investigation about this matter. And this is not new. Actually, exactly today, it's the 4th anniversary of a similar assassination that took place in Gaza against a first aid provider who was a colleague of mine. Her name was Razan Najjar, who was 21 years old, who was providing first aid to people when an Israeli sniper shot her in the heart and killed her. So the Israeli behavior, for instance, this year has taken the lives of 59 Palestinians so far, including a woman today, this morning. And the Israeli declared policy after these accords is very clear. The Israeli government, headed by Naftali Bennett and by a group that includes Gantz and Lapid, has declared more than once and repeatedly that they have no plan whatsoever to have any political contact with the Palestinian side, that they are aiming at restricting relationship to Palestinians only in the fields of security coordination and maybe some economic coordination. But that does not change the situation, does not improve the situation. As a matter of fact, I think 3 Israeli plans have failed. The first plan was to declare that there will be economic peace instead of peace, which is, by the way, a major substance of the so-called deal of the century. What we see in Palestine is very serious economic deterioration rather than improvement. Just to give you an idea, the Israeli GDP per capita is $46,000, while the Palestinian GDP per capita is only 2,400 in the West Bank and less than 1,000 in Gaza. Yet, we are obliged to buy products at Israeli market price because of an imposed market and tax union. More than that, we Palestinians are obliged to pay double the price for water and electricity in comparison to what Israelis pay. So, economic peace, there is no economic peace. Shrinking the conflict, this was the second declared strategy by Israeli government. You can all see that the conflict is not shrinking, it is actually widening and expanding. So the second plan failed. The third plan was to use normalization as an alternative to association with Palestinians. And that, in my opinion, also is failing because the Palestinian issue is on the table. It did not disappear, and it will not disappear thanks to the constant struggle of the Palestinian people for their rights. In reality, maybe one of the outcomes of these accords is the consolidation of the system of apartheid against Palestinians. I know that Israelis feel very anxious when we say the word apartheid, but I always challenge them to give me a different description of a situation where Israel confiscates 85% of water resources in the West Bank, allows Palestinian citizens to use no more than 50 cubic meters of water per capita per year, while illegal Israeli settlers are allowed to use 2,400 cubic meters, 48 times more than Palestinians, from the water of the West Bank. Segregated roads, it's a phenomena that did not exist even during the Bantustan times and apartheid in South Africa, where major highways are exclusive for Israelis. Blocking Palestinian free movement. More than 90% of Palestinians in the West Bank are prohibited from entering Jerusalem, including myself, although I was born in Jerusalem and I worked there as a medical doctor for 15 years. All of Gaza Strip is practically prohibited from reaching West Bank or Gaza or Jerusalem. We live in 224 small islands separated from each other in the West Bank by 640 military checkpoints. And we are separated also by the wall and by Israeli illegal settlements. So we live in Pantostans, or in other words, to be more precise, since these entities, the 224 small islands, are so small, maybe they should be called ghetto stands rather than Pantostans. So with this system of segregation, people feel that nothing has improved. On the contrary, things have gotten worse. In reality, the reality of what we live today was very well described by Amnesty International in their report, describing the system of apartheid. It was also confirmed by Human Rights Watch and almost B'Tselem. Of course, all of that was also reported first by ISQA report, which unfortunately the UN did not publish. We have a very serious situation. I mean, the reality is a reality of apartheid. And what Palestinians are very concerned about and angry about is this horrible amount of double standard when it comes to the Palestinian issue. People ask why. In the case of Ukraine, because of what is described as occupation, there has been 6,000 punitive acts, 6,000 sanctions against Russia in 2 weeks, and not a single sanction on Israel for 74 years. That is the real question. And in my opinion, this double standard is very reflective of the actual policy of those who keep talking about two-state solution and while doing nothing about the fact that Israel is killing and destroying, or actually has killed the two-state solution, creating only one reality, which is a one apartheid state, which would leave Palestinians only with one option, which is to demand, instead of one apartheid state, a one democratic state with equal rights and equal duties. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to speak to you.
Thank you, Dr. Barghouti. This was very insightful, as usual. I will open the door for questions. I think Sami Jadallah want to ask a question. I see he's gone. Anybody would like to ask a question, please?
Hello. I would like to ask a question, if possible. My name is Halima Al-Busaidi.
Yes, please, go ahead.
My question is to anyone, really. To what extent is the deteriorating situation, the economic and humanitarian situation, directly correlated with the accords and the signing of the accords?
Okay. Maha or Dr. Barghouti, would like to take the question. Maha.
Yeah, actually, we're talking about, as you have said, a deterioration, a real exacerbation of the current situation in the Gaza Strip. We can say that the situation has been already devastating in the Gaza Strip, but after the Abraham Accords, we can say that Israel has been given a green light to continue its abuses and even do it in a more fierce way. Like we have said that only a few months after these accords, a deadly military attack was launched on the Gaza Strip, where dozens of actually international media outlets have been also bombed by the Israeli aircrafts and etc. And Israel has actually not cooperated with any UN inquiry committee until now. And this maybe indicates the extent to which Israel has been encouraged by such accords. Such accords are usually given to a country that has been following or respecting international law or international humanitarian law, and Israel basically understands these accords as a reward for its behavior for the past decades, which gives it maybe a sign that to continue what it has been doing. So doing this extent of violations in the Palestinian territories in general and in the Gaza Strip where I live, and I have witnessed the deterioration of the humanitarian situation and the restrictions that have been imposed throughout the past 2 years after the imposition of the or the signing of the accords. Maybe I can say clearly that such accords have encouraged Israel to maybe use a greater force in confronting even civilians living in the Palestinian territories.
Thank you. We have a question from Radwan Masmoudi. Dr. Barghouti, are you with us?
Yes, I'm with you.
Okay.
I'd like to add something actually about this question of the economic situation. Just very shortly. Emirates has just signed with Israel a free trade agreement. That free trade agreement does not exclude settlements from the agreement, which means that Emirates is going to be encouraging the import of settlement products, and that means they are supporting a system of violation of international law, and this is going to affect us drastically because this will encourage more land confiscation, more settlement building, and more exploitation of Palestinian workers in these areas. So this is one example of Israel gets the economic benefit and Palestinians get the land confiscation and the loss of their land and water and economic resources. It's just one example of many why these accords are actually hurting the Palestinians and encouraging Israel to upscale their oppressive system against Palestinians.
Thank you. Yeah, Radwan Masmoudi goes back to the issue of Abraham Accord. He's asking, I'm really interested in learning more about the contents and the specifics of the deal of the century and the Abraham Accord. What is it exactly that Israel gets recognition and normalization, but what do Arab regimes and dictators get in return? Are there any specifics?
Well, I think here this is not written in the deal of the century, but I wrote a whole book about the deal of the century. If you're interested, I don't know if it's in Arabic and not translated yet, but if you are interested, you can get a copy of that. And it details every aspect of the deal of the century. And it's, I think, very important for people to read because although Trump is gone and his deal is gone with him, the actual reality is that Israel is implementing this deal on the ground and implementing each part of it systematically. Now, on the issue of what do these countries get from Israel, they get three things probably, or they dream about getting three things. First of all, American support, that the United States will support them, the support of the United States of these regimes will be stronger. Second, they will get intelligence information from Israel, and they have already bought several intelligence softwares, including Pegasus and others. And third, we are clearly seeing here some serious military cooperation. There is already a serious military deal with Israel where Morocco is buying military equipment from Israel, and I think another country, maybe Sudan. So we're talking here about military and intelligence cooperation and further American support. These are the things that these countries are getting. But more important, they are allowing the Israeli side to distance them from the Palestinian people.
Thank you. By the way, what's the name of the book, Dr. Barghouti, your book?
It's called خدعة القرن, the ploy of the century. It was published by مركز الدراسات العربية في بيروت.
Thank you. We have a question from Joey Musmar. Two questions. Is there any chance that the ongoing Israeli aggression would unite the Palestinian political factions? I think that's every Palestinian's question. This continued infighting within the Palestinian camp, especially between Hamas and Fatah, hurts the Palestinian cause. And second question, what does UAE get from Abraham Accords beyond security cooperation? I think Dr. Barghouti just answered it, but I can add to that that many Arab regimes after the Arab Spring were terrified of the Arab Spring. The late journalist Jamal Khashoggi was a good friend of mine, and we used to spend lots of time together. And he told me he used to work for King Abdullah as a media advisor at the time of the Arab Spring. And he told me, you have no idea of the fear in the palace. They were terrified of seeing the masses in the hundreds of thousands, whether in Cairo or in Tunis or in Kuwait. Kuwait had also big demonstrations, even though Kuwait have a functioning parliament and they have relatively free press. There was big demonstrations in Bahrain. I think that was a game changer for particularly the Gulf regimes, the Egyptians, and at that point they thought they will do anything to maintain or to ensure that this doesn't happen again. So the deal with the Pegasus to get the software that spies on people with the Israelis, cooperation with Israel intelligence, lots of that stuff became more important. The continuation of these regimes or these families in power without having to share any responsibility with their population became the most important thing. And I believe this is what they care about. They believe being on the good side of Israel, they will help them with security. I don't think really Iran endangered any of these regimes. Actually, Iran played a destructive role and added, in Iraq and Lebanon and Syria, Iran been a very negative force and getting things much worse, and the atrocities committed both Iraq and Syria. Iran is responsible for a big chunk of that. So anyway, going to the subject, these regimes, they care about the continuation of the regime. That includes Sudan, which also been suffering from heavy sanctions for many, many, many years. Even though they complied, they did lots of they complied with many U.S. demands in the last 20 years, and still they could not get sanctions lifted. They couldn't be lifted from the countries that sponsor terrorism until they signed the Abraham Accord. That's only when the U.S. left them from or removed them from the terrorism list. So these were incentives. There were lots of carrots for these countries to sign these agreements just to sign with Israel. And it's really amazing that America have their, I would not say diplomat, Jared Kushner wasn't a diplomat, he had no experience, and he looked about Israel's interest. Even Trump said that, and he went around using US influence to sell to Arab countries in favor of Israel. Mustafa, do you like to add anything, or Maha?
I want to respond to the question about Palestinian unity.
Yes, go ahead.
Well, whether these things have pushed Palestinians closer to solving the internal division or not, unfortunately not yet. But I would say that the only two factors that would lead to ending the internal Palestinian division is first of all a strategic agreement. That there would be an agreement about which strategy Palestinians will use. At this very moment, as you can see, the Palestinian Authority is stuck with a failing project. With Oslo Agreement that Israel has killed, they are stuck with security coordination with Israel, although the PLO Security Council since 2015 has taken a resolution to end it. They are stuck with false hopes about negotiations that will never happen. And they are stuck with unrealistic hopes that the American administration will get in and force Israel to take the path of peace talks. Because of that, I think there is now a very serious gap between the Palestinian Authority and the rest of the Palestinian community. It's not anymore a difference between PA and Hamas or Fatah and Hamas. It's now a different, there is a dispute between the authority and the whole Palestinian population. And that's why the first condition for reconciliation is really that the PA would accept to change its course and understand that without Palestinian struggle, nothing will change. The second factor that is very important relates to the fact that the Palestinian Authority does not want to allow democratic participation. They canceled free elections, as you know, in an unjustified manner. We were about to have elections last year, and we haven't had elections since 2006. The only structure that was elected by the people, besides the president, was the Palestinian Legislative Council, and the PA has eliminated that council in 2018 without conducting new elections, which was also an illegal act. So practically without internal democracy, without the PA accepting, and Hamas and everybody accepting the right of the people to choose their leaders, I do not think we can have real unity. So these are the two major factors. What strategy can unify Palestinians, and whether democracy will be reestablished with separation of powers between the executive, the judiciary, and the legislative powers. At this moment, it's one executive authority. It's practically one person with people around him who are making all the decisions and making all the legislations. And that is not sustainable, and also it does not provide any base for proper unity.
Thank you. I'd like to hear Maha, please.
Yeah, actually, because of my position as a worker at Euromed Human Rights Monitor, I can answer questions more related to the human rights situation, but I have noticed one question related to my talk, which is from Sami. He's talking about the agreement made by the PLO, Arafat Abbas, who negotiated and signed long before the Arab states' agreements with Israel. Well, actually, for decades, the Palestinians have been told to attempt or to follow the peace talks and the peace path with Israel, and have been condemned for decades for encouraging or taking part or supporting the what we call the armed resistance or the armed path in many cases. And until today, although the armed resistance is recognized and allowed in international law by people who are fighting for their self-determination and for their basic human rights, as been happening here in the Palestinian territories, even though it is allowed by the international community, we still see that the vast majority of governments and international communities still condemning Palestinians for retaliating to such abuses and such attacks that have been occurring on a daily basis. For example, Palestinian armed groups, or what we call here in Palestine the Palestinian resistance, are labeled as terrorist groups or terrorist organizations by the US, by the basic powers, or the international community in general. Back in 2006, for example, when the Palestinian people elected Hamas for the legislative elections, and what happened after that, after Hamas took over the Gaza Strip, the consequences were that there was a collective punishment imposed against 2 million residents of the Gaza Strip. We are talking about an impoverished strip that has been deprived of their basic rights only for supporting, let's say, or having a de facto government called Hamas, which is labeled as a terrorist organization by Israel. The strip has been turned into a closed area, we can say, and now 16 years later, the Gaza Strip is witnessing one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world. So the thing is that Palestinians, since the Palestinian Nakba and the establishment of Israel in 1948, Palestinians have been asked to follow peace talks and the peace path with Israel. And the Palestinian Authority actually is facing enormous pressure by the international community despite its long-term conflict with Hamas, the de facto government of the Gaza Strip. And I'm not trying to give excuses, actually. I'm not in a place to give excuses for example, the Palestinian Authority or the Palestinians for signing accords or the Oslo Accords or other accords. But this is the fact on the ground. I'm talking about an enormous pressure imposed on the Palestinian leadership. If you are talking about the Arafat, Abbas, or any other leadership, the Israeli government and the US are imposing collective punishment of Palestinians in general, and the international community, more than 70 years later, is still requiring Palestinians to follow the peace talks. We are still witnessing that the UN, for example, the international community is still condemning the Palestinian armed groups for retaliating to such attacks. So what we need today is the political will by the international community to recognize the Palestinians' right to armed resistance, for example, because I'm not talking about something that is a taboo, for example. This is recognized by the international humanitarian law for people living under occupation and for people willing or struggling to get self-determination. It is allowed for these people. So, but the international community is still not recognizing this right for Palestinians. And this is the result, actually. We are seeing Israel imposing more restrictions on Palestinians, committing more war crimes against Palestinians, and not getting enough condemnation or enough pressure to hold such violations. On the contrary, Palestinians are the ones that are dealt with as they are making Palestinians equal to an occupying power, and the Palestinians are asked to follow the peace talks with Israel until this moment. So I guess that it is true that there are mistakes that happened in the Palestinian history, which, let's say, the Oslo Accords is one of them, but this is one of the consequences of the pressure imposed by the international community on the Palestinians in general and the Palestinian leadership in particular, given that Israel is supported by the US, which has resulted recently in the Abraham Accords and etc.
Thank you. We have a question from Jack Yanuchik. A common argument made by Israeli apologists is that the accusations of apartheid are inaccurate because they claim the Arab Israeli population has civil and political rights with a degree of political participation. Could any of you speak to the validity of such a claim?
I can speak about this. First of all, I think anybody who wants to understand very well the system of apartheid should read the Amnesty International report. It's really an excellent report. It is factual. It presents all the objective proofs of the system of apartheid. And the main conclusion in Amnesty International report is that it confirms what ISQA report has reported, which is that the apartheid system is used against Palestinians not only in the occupied territories but also in Israel itself, as well as Palestinians in the diaspora. And they detail the actual signs and of this system of apartheid in each particular case. I will not go into details of what's happening to Palestinians who have Israeli citizenship, but let me just mention one thing. When Israel was established in the land of Israel, the Palestinian community owned approximately 82% of the land. Today, they own only 3.5%. I mean, all of this land was confiscated in an illegal manner, according to international law. And it is not true that Palestinians, although people are allowed to participate in elections for the Knesset and so on, but that doesn't mean they have the same rights like Jewish people. And the most important law in Israel today is the one passed by the Knesset, which said that the right of self-determination is exclusive to Jewish people when it comes to the land of Israel. That by itself is a sufficient indication that apartheid is practiced against all Palestinians, whether they live in Israel or in the occupied territories or in the diaspora, especially those in the diaspora. Any American Jewish person or Russian Jewish person who has never been to Palestine before would get Israeli citizenship immediately in the airport as soon as he lands in Lod airport, or Ben Gurion airport, as they call it. And while Palestinians who lived here for hundreds and thousands of years and who were displaced illegally from their land have no right not only to come back to their homeland, but they have no right even to visit this homeland. So that alone is a very clear indication of how profound this system of apartheid is.
Thank you. We have questions. Go ahead.
I just want to add also that most of most of people say that Palestinians in Israel have the same rights as Jewish Israeli, but actually on the ground, we have documented several cases in which they face widespread discrimination. A history of separation between Arabs and Jewish has meant the two peoples mostly live apart, except in certain mixed cities. Many of the Palestinians living in Israel are considered even as a second-class citizens. The Arab citizens of Israel actually face discrimination on a daily basis that contribute to poverty, for example. The poverty rate stands at, for example, 36%. Among Arab Palestinians in Israel, which is twice as of Jews. They have actually poor access, in most of the cases, poor access to work, jobs, services, daily services, and they have underrepresentation in politics, for example. They face also not only by the government or by the authorities, but also inside the communities where they live in their towns and villages, etc. They also face large-scale discrimination among the residents. So this is not actually the case that Palestinians have equal rights as Jewish Israelis.
Thank you. We have a question from Dr. Ghassan. Please, Dr. Ghassan, you want to ask, Ghassan Boudiab would like to ask a question directly. Can you turn your microphone on?
Yes, sure. Do you hear me now?
Yes.
So, hello, everybody. I have, I mean, we've been following all that time, the Abraham Accords. The definition, again, of the Abraham Accords is still vague. And for example, if you see UAE or Israel or Bahrain's perspective about that one, every country does have its perspective. For example, American descriptions, they call them the Abrahamic agreements. But the aim, in my humble opinion, is it's made a major geopolitical shift in the region. And the mainstay of this transformation is the normalization of Israel's presence and the acceptance of the role of Israel, but also rather making it the focus of security, of political and economic strategies of these countries and the countries in the region. And the significance of the religious dimension also becomes clear from the designation of these two agreements as Abrahamic or Abraham agreements, related to Abraham as, you know, he's considered the father of all the monotheistic traditions or religions. But still, for example, in Bahrain, it was called the Declaration for a Peace Intent rather than the Abrahamic Accords. And that's what the parliament in Bahrain agreed on. Peace and blessing, I mean, upon Abraham, but because he's considered, as we say, the father of the prophets and the monotheistic religions. But again, what will be the impact, the direct impact? In fact, in my humble opinion, it's an investment for the future. And still, if there is no accompanying from the people of these countries, rather than the governments of these countries, they will still be without clothes and jaws, as we say. So they're still like they're not monetarized. And it's very hard to monetize these accords, given the balance of powers in Israel, getting leftist versus rightist government, and at the same time, how quick would the governments of these countries are ready to go within the peace process. So they're not more than intents, as we say. And it was required or needed in a certain era in the presidential campaign in the United States. That's my humble opinion. So I don't find like that super strategic at the level of you know, what would be the impact of the Abrahamic Accords on the future of the Middle East region. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone would like to comment?
I have a question.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, my question is for Dr. Barghouti, and perhaps Maha could answer this. When it comes to the free trade agreement signed by the UAE and Israel, was there any protest or protestations or reaction from the Palestinian Authority as the government of the Palestinian people regarding this? And I find the comment that it was not excluding the Israeli settlements. That was very interesting and very intriguing, to be quite honest with you. So I'm just wondering if there's any comment or reaction from the Palestinians themselves on this agreement. Thank you.
To my knowledge, there has not been any declaration from the side of the Palestinian Authority. I don't know if Maha has a different opinion, but or information. I did not hear anything from the PA about it, but there was a lot of popular criticism and criticism from the side of people like me who are in opposition to the Palestinian Authority.
Thank you.
Yeah, as Dr. Barghouti said, there has been no formal declaration by the Palestinian Authority, but we can notice that there has been widespread opposition of the accords and this step the Arab countries have taken for the past 2 years. But until now, we have not seen any formal declaration or formal position against this accord.
I want to add something here because it relates not just to this matter, but to many other matters, including sustaining security coordination with the occupying force. In reality, it's increasingly becoming clear that the first priority for the PA is to sustain itself and sustain its survival as an authority. And clearly, this is affecting their ability to take the right position that reflects the opinion of the Palestinian people when it comes to serious matters like this free trade agreement that did not exclude settlements. At least in some European countries, they do demand that there will be labeling of settlement products. In this case, nothing. And there was no criticism whatsoever.
Well, there was West Bank settlements wine sold in Dubai markets, so this is not new. Yeah. There's a question here from Sami Jadallah. Sami, do you like to ask the question directly or like me to read it? We have been talking about international laws for over 70 years. Nothing is happening. How can we achieve anything while the organizations that claims representative of the people is a partner with the Israeli occupation? Liberation starts with liberating ourselves from the PLO and this leadership.
Okay, can I answer this question? Yeah.
Yes, please.
So yeah, actually, this is what we've been talking about for the past decades, that Palestinians are required and have been asked to adhere by international law and to attempt to follow the peace talks and peace path, while Israel is actually following a totally different path, which is the daily violation of human rights and international law, and being in complete disregard for international law. What we are actually talking about is the lack of political will by the international community and the major countries. And this is what we are actually what we have been condemning for the past few years, since the imposition of the Gaza blockade, since the Palestinian Nakba, and etc. What we're talking about here is that the international community is dealing with the Palestinians the same as it has been dealing with Israel as an occupying power, which is requiring Palestinians to adhere by international law while also allowing Israel to commit such violations that amount to war crimes and crimes against humanity. So actually, the answer to your question, I cannot answer your question actually, but I can only say that there is a lack of political will to impose sanctions on Israel. And we have seen by the Abraham Accords that not only the world has been silent towards Israel's violations, but it also encouraging Israel by signing accords and giving it a reward for its war crimes. So yeah, actually, this is a very good question, but unfortunately, we Palestinians cannot answer, as we have been required for the past few years to be dealing with Israel or to be following the peace talks while Israel has been committing war crimes against us. So yeah.
Dr. Mustafa?
Let me respond to this question. First of all, I don't think the idea of liberating ourselves from the PLO is the right approach. But the question, what we should say here is that what we need is really restructuring the PLO completely. Why? Because there is a dangerous element here, which is that the PLO has been recognized before it was governed by Fatah. I mean, when it was established, the PLO was later recognized, especially in 1974, by all Arab countries and by the world community as the representative of the Palestinian people. Eliminating the PLO in this regard creates a very serious danger about who is going to be representing the Palestinians. And we have here a very serious risk of repeating what happened in 1948 and in the 50s, where some Arab countries would claim that they are the ones who represent the Palestinians. And that never ended in the right place. And that's why I think sustaining the PLO as a structure, as an idea, is very important, but reforming it is very necessary. Without elections for the Palestinian National Council, the PLO itself will continue to be marginal. It has been totally marginalized by the Palestinian Authority. It is totally controlled by the Palestinian Authority, and it has no serious role in leading the liberation of the Palestinian people. That's why our demand is very clear: elections for the Palestinian National Council, in which all Palestinians should be allowed to participate, whether they live in the diaspora or they live inside Palestine. And electing a new leadership means electing a new Palestinian National Council democratically. At this very moment, we are governed by an undemocratic system. And the PLO itself is still excluding major political parties from being inside its structure. As Palestinian National Initiative, we were established 20 years ago, and we are the youngest Palestinian movement. It took us a whole 10 years to be accepted as member of the PLO. But even when we were accepted, we were not allowed to be really represented in the executive committee of the PLO. So in my opinion, today the PLO is in deep trouble, in deep crisis. We should not throw it away with the bad content in it. We should try to reform it, and that can only happen through free democratic elections.
Thank you. Any more questions?
I had one final question.
Sure.
So my question is, now that the accords have taken place, what actions could other Arab states take moving forward?
If I may respond to this.
Yes, please.
Well, let's be realistic here. I think we, the Palestinians, have learned in a very hard way the very difficult lesson of we have to rely on ourselves, and we have to practice self-reliance. And as we say in Arabic, "Ma hakka jildaka matla dhufrak." We cannot wait for others to solve our problem. This was learned in the most painful way. And today there is a very serious Palestinian will and a common sense that our future depends on our ability to struggle for our freedom and our rights. But regarding Arab countries, our demand is exactly what we are demanding from the international community, from those who believe in freedom and self-determination and the rights of the people, whether they are Americans or Arabs or Chinese or Russians. What we want from the Arab countries is not to send their armies to fight Israel. We know that this is unrealistic and will never happen. What we want from Arab countries is to join the boycott, divestment, sanctions against the apartheid system of Israel. This is not against Jewish people. It's not an anti-Semitic call. It's a call to repeat what was done in South Africa at one point of time, which is to boycott the system of apartheid and occupation. And that is what we are demanding from Arab peoples and from Arab governments. And this is the measure, the real true measurement of whether there is really serious solidarity with Palestinians or not.
Thank you. Any more questions, please? Well, that concludes our event. I would like to thank Dr. Mustafa Barghouti. I'd like to thank Maha Hussaini from Gaza for their participation for this insightful presentation. And I would like to thank our audience for their participation. Thank you all. Hope to see you in another event soon. We have an event at the end of June about the Uyghurs, where the U.S. Ambassador for Religious Freedom will be speaking with us about his new book, and hopefully Josh Rogan from the Washington Post will be moderating the event. Thank you again.